Thank you for joining us today as we kick off our webinar, Shedding Light on Shifting Education Policies in the MENA region to respond to COVID-19. My name is Nawal Qutb and I am the Vice President of the Harvard Club of Jordan, and I will be moderating tonight's session. We will put everyone on mute. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat box. We will have some time towards the end of the session. I assume that your videos are off. If your video is not off and you are not a speaker, please turn off your video. Thank you very much. Just so that you know, this webinar will be recorded. This webinar is a collaboration between the Harvard Club of Jordan, Harvard Club of UAE, and Harvard Club of Egypt. I would like to turn it over now for a couple of welcoming words by the presidents of each of the clubs. To start with the Harvard Club of Jordan, Basil. I think, yeah, you're unmuted now, I think, Basil.
Yes, thank you, Nawal. Thank you. On behalf of the Harvard Club of Jordan, I'd like to thank everybody for joining this webinar. And special thanks, of course, to Professor Fernando, Sajida, Nelly, and for the moderator, Nawal. Everybody shares with me how important this topic. I mean, this is unprecedented crisis that we've been through, and all our kids have suffered from the massive changes of the educational process due to the pandemic of COVID-19. And we are very much eager to hear from our distinguished panelists about the changes in policy, how this is going to impact our future. Hopefully the pandemic at some point of time and the disease will stop, but this is something that's still not yet decided. I think this is an important initiative where 3 clubs of Harvard in the region have collaborated in this. This shows how much we have depth of knowledge and richness of knowledge among the alumni in the region, and we hope to do that more often. And I'm sure you're all eager to hear from the panelists. So back to you, Nawal, and thank you for doing this.
Thank you very much, Basil. I'd like now to turn it over to Sajida, the president of the Harvard Club of UAE. Sajida, over to you.
Thank you, Nawal, and thank you, Basil. Bismillah. It's a pleasure to collaborate with Harvard Club of Jordan and Harvard Club of Egypt. We especially want to thank Harvard Club of Jordan for taking the initiative to develop this webinar. As we all know, COVID-19 has led us all to cancel many events and plans, but it has also brought us together. It has led to many webinars as brands and businesses seek to remain relevant and help us make sense of these uncertain times and what is yet to come. As alumni communities, though, it's a nice way for us to connect on a more human level. We felt that we could all learn from each other by sharing our views on what will be the impact and outcomes for us across our region and how we can see the silver linings. Harvard Club of the UAE has held several webinars on the impact of COVID-19 on our region, and we have therefore had the opportunity to consider next steps across various sectors, including government, technology, sustainability, business, etc. Today, we have the opportunity to hear reflections and thoughts regarding education, an area that is, of course, very close to my heart. As president, let me add that it is wonderful to have so many of you here to join us from across the region and around the world. We are very appreciative that you're taking the time. Also, we'd like to extend our appreciation in advance to Professor Fernando and to Nelly for sharing your perspectives. I'm truly honored to be on the panel with you. Thank you also to Nawal. It's been a pleasure collaborating with you. Back to you, Nawal.
Thank you, Sajida. Now turning it over to the president of the Harvard Club of Egypt, Mahmoud.
Hi, so I'm the secretary of the Harvard Club of Egypt. I'm Mahmoud Al-Fiki. I'm an associate professor of surgery. And I wanted to thank you so much for the opportunity to have us here. Well, thank you so much, Sajida, and thank you, Nawal, for the lovely moderation. And it's a pleasure to be here among all the other presidents of the region Harvard clubs. We're still a nascent club in the region. We're still starting with a few hundred alumni from Egypt, but we're picking up the pace to join you guys in all the efforts that you're going to make this happen through the region. I hope this would be a very helpful and very useful webinar for everyone from around the region. And I give the microphone. And I want to also thank Rawia from the Harvard Club of Egypt for all the help that she's done helping us organizing this event. So I'll pass to the next one. Thank you.
Thanks, Mahmoud. So before we start, also please allow me to welcome our panelists for this evening. Professor Fernando Reimers, Ford Foundation Professor of the Practice of International Education and Director of the Global Education Innovation Initiative and of International Education Policy Master's Program at Harvard University. Fernando has a doctoral and master's degrees in education from Harvard. Next, we have Sajida Hasan Shroff, who is the president of the Harvard Club of the UAE and president of the Harvard GlobalWE. She's the CEO of Altamont Group, Education Investment and Advisory. Sajida invests in developing innovative education ecosystems and advises governments regarding innovation. Sajida has a Master's of Education from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and she's a nominee for elected Harvard Alumni Association Director. By the way, if you are a Harvard alum and haven't voted yet, Sajida has done a lot in the field of education and for the alumni in the region. I hope you take that into consideration as you submit your ballot in the coming few days. Last but definitely not least, we are honored to have on our panel tonight from Egypt, Nelly Zayat. Nelly is the co-founder and director of Newton Education Services and is the advisor to the Minister of Education on Early Childhood Education and Education Policy. Nelly holds a master's degree in international education policy from Harvard University. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation to join our panel tonight. We're very excited to have you with us. I'm looking at the names and I'm aware tonight we have a heavy participation with people joining from different parts of the world. Welcome and ahlan wa sahlan, as we say in Arabic. I'm also aware we have people joining from different fields and industries, and that is very exciting to see. Therefore, please allow me to start off by giving an overview and some facts and figures before I turn it over to our speakers tonight. We have some time allocated, like I mentioned before, towards the end of the session to take questions from the audience. So in early 2020, novel coronavirus 2019, COVID-19 for short, as we all know, has made it to the MENA region. By March of this year, governments in the region have rapidly taken measures in the early stages to slow down the abrupt spread of the pandemic by imposing strict containment measures that limited the movement of millions of people. Given the pandemic risk, several countries declared a state of national emergency, starting mostly by closing schools, nurseries, and higher education institutions. Each of the countries in the region was impacted by COVID-19 differently, and the situation of course differs for the Gulf countries to developing economies in the Levant or North Africa, or in fragile and conflict-affected countries such as Syria, Iraq, Gaza Strip, Yemen, and Libya. Although as of May, countries have been progressively and carefully starting to ease restrictions on movement and economic activities as well, however, schools and universities remain closed for now in many countries in the region. According to UNICEF, there are more than 100 million school-age students between the ages of 5 and 17 in the MENA region who have limited access to education, formal and non-formal, due to closure of schools, university facilities, youth centers, and public spaces. The MENA region hosts about 14 million displaced persons, many of which are young people who are more prone to suffer disproportionately, both from the crisis and its aftermath. Jordan and Lebanon host among the highest number of refugees per capita worldwide. In response to closure of school, ministries of education and higher education acted quickly in making curriculums available online and by broadcasting classes via TV or radio. Although governments exerted strenuous efforts to ensure children remain engaged in the learning process, yet one of the biggest challenges was reaching all children. The lack of access to electricity, technological devices such as tablets, laptops, etc., and free, reliable internet hindered distance education, especially for vulnerable children, including children with disabilities. The transition to online learning came with its own package of challenges. To begin with, the telecom infrastructure in the region can be described as inconsistent. The learning environment did not only change for the students overnight, but it also changed abruptly for teachers who had very limited time to prepare for the shift in teaching, and for parents who had to partake a larger share in their children's learning. COVID-19 has also surfaced some opportunities, which we will delve into further detail in this webinar. But just to give you a glimpse into how some of the countries in the MENA region made the best out of the situation. For example, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and Morocco are some of the countries that were the first in the region to build innovative partnerships in no time to continue the delivery of education in a new and unfamiliar environment, teaching concepts using different approaches, or what is referred to as multimodal approach. So the challenge of COVID-19 has presented us with many opportunities, which we will discuss further during this session, like I mentioned. But let me start first with Fernando. Fernando, thanks again for joining this panel. I want to start off by asking you, how did COVID-19 impact education policies in your view? Did it push us closer or pull us away from reaching SDG 4? And just so that everybody is aware, SDG 4, SDG is Sustainable Development Goal number 4 by the UN, which states ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. Thank you, and over to you, Fernando.
Thank you, Nawal, for your own leadership. And I want to thank the leadership of the 3 Harvard clubs of Jordan, Egypt, and the UAE in bringing us together. I want to say that in organizing this meeting, you're doing what the rest of the university is doing, which is to stepping up through our various schools and centers to figure out how can we be of service to the cause of finding a solution to the pandemic and of mitigating and alleviating the impact that it is having. I can tell you that not only are schools of medicine and public health, which are really at the forefront of the epidemiological work around this crisis, but in many other schools, there is a lot of good work happening. For example, at the School of Education, many of my colleagues are participating in a regular series that connects faculty with practitioners in identifying what are the needs in education and the opportunities to address it, to provide educational continuity. Myself, for the last 3 months, I have redirected the Global Education Innovation Initiative that I lead to try to be of service to education leaders at the school level and at the system level in finding ways to sustain educational opportunity. So my responses are going to be framed through that perspective. I have to date conducted, and I'm going to share some slides so that you know the work I've done in answering your very good question. So can you now see my screen as I speak? Can you see my screen?
Yep, we can see it.
Yeah. So what I have done so far is to basically conduct 2 surveys, one 3 months ago, one half a month ago, with colleagues in about 100 countries around the world, asking the question of what has the educational impact of this pandemic been and what responses are in place. And I've engaged in this work colleagues at the OECD, the World Bank, and the Organization 100. We are also conducting case studies of exemplary practices of sustaining educational opportunity, both as a way to help others learn from that and as a way to capture the underlying processes that allow such innovation. So these are some of the case studies that we have. I have put on the website a link where you can find them. Our goal is to identify people who are positive deviants. Those of you who've taken my classes know how I depend on teaching you from those who are ahead of the pack so that we can help everybody else learn along and document in great detail what are the details of implementing those practices. From that work, this is what I have learned. Let me just get to the lessons. The first lesson is that education, the idea that education is a human right, is actually normalized. I find it fascinating that in the middle of a global pandemic that has infected more than 10 million people and taken the lives of more than 500,000, we are as concerned about the right of children to be educated as we are about preserving life. And just to put it in perspective, the last big pandemic in 1918, and now writing about educating in a pandemic, education was not only not one of the top 3 concerns, it wasn't one of the top 10. So that is amazing that we are having this conversation about education. The second thing that I have learned in this work is how much professionalism educators have. Teachers, school principals, system level leaders, people have gone above and beyond, demonstrating that to them, this is not just a job, this is a mission. And that our mission is to ensure that children are educated. It's very important to highlight that. The third thing that I have learned is that there is already an expanded ecosystem that can be strengthened that supports innovation, great innovative capacity of teachers, great power from partnerships across government institutions and with civil society. Right now, engaged in a research project looking at how 25 universities around the world have partnered with school systems to sustain educational opportunity. And what I see is phenomenal. There is a real flourishing of innovation that results from collaboration. As we speak, the number of meetings of this sort that are taking place around the world, where people who don't normally talk to one another are talking to one another, is expanded exponentially, and creativity and innovation is coming out of that. There is definite capacity of schools and systems to learn. Technology obviously has helped us not just sustain education, but new ways to lead and to manage. And I think there is great generosity of many and spirit of collaboration, which are really at the root of that. I also think that in this moment, there is something that is causing people to do the unexpected, to ask deep questions about what is the meaning of what we do. So over the last 3 months, I published these 3 books, and I knew they were going to be published before I knew there was going to be a pandemic. And my thought was, no one is going to pay any attention. To my surprise, these are the number of people who have downloaded these books. Now that is a little bit puzzling, that in the middle of a global pandemic, where 10 million people are infected, 122,000 people have taken an interest in global citizenship education, that 73,000 people have an interest in examining comparative reforms. It's not what I would have expected. I've placed a link where you can download these books for free, but I'm delighted to see that. So in concluding to your comments, in the 1300s, the world was ravaged by another pandemic. It was called the Black Death. It was a pandemic that in 2 years took the lives of 25 million people in Italy, which represented 1/3 of the population. And paradoxically, in spite of all the pain and suffering caused, that pandemic also caused people to look around and ask very deep questions about the existing social order, which was a very stagnant, very hierarchical order, very conservative order. And that pandemic caused the mobility, the economic and social mobility of people like the Medicis, who were this family that managed in Florence to create what has been described as the Medici effect. They brought together people like Michelangelo, like Leonardo, like Raphael, like Machiavelli. And out of that convergence, out of that collaboration of people in a small place, came all the ideas that brought about the Renaissance. My hope is that the collaboration that this pandemic is causing, the deep questions that it is causing us to ask, it is going to bring about a renaissance in education. And the effort that you, Nawal, and the leaders of the 3 clubs are demonstrating today in bringing together 56 people from across the Middle East to ask these questions, I think is at the root of those efforts. So I'm very encouraged by the possibilities.
Thank you, Fernando. Sajida, so could you tell us more about some of the major education shifts that took place in the UAE, and what worked in your point of view? What could be transferred to other countries as well? Although bearing in mind that different countries have different settings, etc. But what worked, and what kind of education shifts and interventions did the UAE implement during these challenging times?
Certainly, Noel. Thank you again for inviting me to be on the panel. It is a privilege to be here with all of you and with such distinguished education leaders. So as Fernando's mentioned, governments globally react to these types of situations with either the rabbit in the headlights sort of perspective or the rapid response. You know, there's either a spirit of let's fix this or a spirit of, oh my God, what do we do? In the case of the GCC and the UAE in particular, we're very fortunate that our governments and the ministries of education provided rapid responses with guidelines to schools that required them to proceed quickly in a manner that safeguarded health concerns as well as then led to quality education. So first of all, on March 8th, the Ministry of Education very, very promptly and very strictly, in a sense, mandated that schools and universities should close physical facilities, okay? This was a quick yet carefully considered guideline to safeguard everyone's health. The Ministry of Education also mandated at the same time, and everybody didn't know how this was going to work, that education should not stop. So indeed, they mandated that teaching needed to be very quickly provided via distance and remote learning. So then on March 22nd, after spring break was coming to an end, all schools were virtually open. Nobody had a choice. They had to figure it out really quickly within 2 weeks. So the ministry also very quickly mobilized with community partners to provide laptops and computers and tablets to students so that learning was not disrupted due to a lack of technology or tools. They activated, as it turns out, virtual learning for nearly 1.2 million students from various schools and universities. So it was quite a rapid ramp up and quite successful. In addition, what they did is they worked with service providers to provide free mobile internet connection for families without home internet services to help them access remote learning. And they also worked with other government authorities to ease other concerns, for example, around residency. So residency visas were all extended until the end of the year, even if they were expiring at that time, which took some stress and pressure off families, because that's always a concern. Now, there was definitely concern also around teacher availability, availability to teach online, their ability to teach online. And so they also worked with university partners to set up a course to extend a free training, an e-training course to more than 42,000 teachers and academic staff to get them up to speed with actually e-teaching and e-learning. So that was another great win. And then we had authorities that also launched like new distance learning platforms where private entities were able to extend assistance to schools, to teachers, to the authorities themselves with apps and websites and services and resources for parents and students and teachers. And all of this was done free of charge, so people could really, get resources as they needed them. The Ministry of Education and the regional education authorities also very quickly implemented a distance learning policy that included various elements such as distance learning quality assurance parameters and school closure guidelines. So they were very strict about this. And very quickly, education authorities developed the first ever distance learning evaluation system with 3 categories: developed, not developed, or partially developed, which was really smart about them, because automatically the schools were told that we're going to be paying attention to this, even though we're not physically in the same system. So that was very well done. And this was actually the first time that there was a joint initiative across 3 Emirates, so across Sharjah, Dubai, and Abu Dhabi. And this allowed, therefore, for cross-country comparisons and learnings. The results have actually already been provided to the schools so they can improve quality and be prepared in case remote learning continues this fall, which we still know is a little bit up in the air. Education authorities also provided very clear parameters for schools to comply if they wanted to open again in September. And this is still a discussion that's happening and that's ongoing, but the government is constantly updating and giving feedback and giving guidelines. So it's super helpful for the education providers as well. And then they have also emphasized that priorities include delivering quality education through equipping and training staff to use digital tools well, innovating educational content, and actively communicating with the parents. So they've hit all of the 3 really key elements on the head and made this part of the ongoing dialogue with the schools and alerting the families that, listen, we're paying attention to this. So, you need to pay attention to us, but don't worry, because we're also looking at it ourselves. And the recommendation that they're making is that school leaders and educators should aim to team with parents and tailor their formats and schedules to satisfy the needs and constraints of the parents and the students. As things evolve and parents are back to work and maybe not working from home, but maybe the kids will have to be home, we'll have to come up with some alternative ways to make things happen. In addition, what's really exciting, I would say, is that there's now greater openness to distance learning and online learning as a credible alternative option, with the inkling that a policy that recognizes and verifies online learning for K-12 and higher education will be implemented soon. We're hearing that that might be in the pipeline, so it's actually very exciting for us in the UAE, because this is something that we haven't ever had. And lastly, I would say that the UAE in particular has been fortunate as our students' education has remained continuous. It has not stopped. And this is very much thanks to the prompt and thoughtful actions of the UAE government.
Thanks, Sajida. Actually, some of the good practices best practices, if I may, that you mentioned, we've also seen a trend in some other countries in the MENA region. Let me just mention education technology that you highlighted came in handy more than ever. Mobile apps that promote learning through play came in as useful tools during the past period, giving a new meaning to learning. So, for example, these apps emerge now more than ever, including but are not limited to Rawi Kids from Egypt, Kitabi Book Reader from Lebanon, Kuwait's Shu'la app, and the UAE's Luigi's. So these apps all came in handy, of course, with the support of governments to encourage these kinds of apps to instill.
And to allow for experimentation. I think that's what was really key, is that they were saying it's open. And make it better. At least we have something that we can try. So it was very exciting to see that also. Openness to innovation.
That's great. And I hear you also saying the support to educators. We also saw like a potential to close the inequity gap among educators. For example, we saw in Lebanon trainings and coaching of teachers offered by the Ministry of Education and Higher Education, normally carried out in person, were moved online. So this allowed for teachers in hard to reach areas kind of equally benefit from these sessions and coaching and mentoring kind of opportunities. Thank you, Sajida. Nelly, so how did Egypt handle the impact of COVID-19 on its education system? Like what kind of measures did they do? Let's see what other countries can take and learn from Egypt.
Sure, thank you, Noel, so much. And thank you, Fernando and Sajida. I'm delighted to be with you all here today. Just for some perspective, so that we have a sense of where Egypt is with the public school system. We're talking about 22 million students in the public school system. So it's a lot of kids and 1.3 million teachers and around 56,000 public schools. So it's really large scale. Everything that happened in Egypt happened across the public school system, and in response to COVID, it covered the entire country. So similar to the UAE, but a week later, the schools closed here March 15th, with the same intention to continue learning despite the physical closure of schools. So this was the plan. And again, like Sajida said, there was a big question mark as to how exactly is this going to happen. So I think I want to just to for the sake of clarity, to sort of divide the students in the system into 4 main groups, because there were 4 main or different ways that students were received the online learning or the different forms of adjustments that had to be made in response to COVID-19. So I'll start with the eldest students. The students who are currently in their last year of school, referred to here as Sanawiyya Amma in Egypt, are actually they actually physically sat or were given the option to physically sit for their tests. As we speak, they are actually being tested throughout this month until July 21st. And they had a choice. They were given a choice to either sit for the test or to postpone the tests without obviously being penalized. But obviously this happened with a lot of precautions, with the social distancing, with wearing the masks, with sanitizers, taking the temperatures. The 56,000 sites were prepared for the tests, such that there were no more than 14 students per site. That was the idea, to keep the social distance. And so this is actually ongoing, and surprisingly, about 96% of the students attended the test. The expectation was that many of them would postpone, but that did not happen. They actually, most of them showed up and are actually sitting for the test. The second group are those just younger, the grade 10s and 11s. Fortunately, Egypt had already embarked on a total transformation of its educational system that had begun in 2018, September 2018. The implementation started September 2018. And part of that transformation was to introduce to the then grade 10s a new sort of mode of learning and testing, which included electronic testing via individual tablets that were given to the students. And a comprehensive library of learning objects, whether they were videos, presentations, games. This is known as the EKB, the Egyptian Knowledge Bank, and it's available and it's for free to everyone inside Egypt.
Actually, Nelly, I've also read that it was also available. The Egyptian government have opened it up to neighboring countries as well.
Correct.
Yeah.
This actually happened as a result of the COVID-19 situation, that access was given to neighboring countries, because originally the EKB required an IP address inside of Egypt. But like you said correctly, it was opened up to neighboring countries as well during this crisis. And so this had already happened, right? And the EKB, the online library, is not just off-shelf material from the partners that the ministry works with. It was actually tailored material that is mapped to the lessons of grade 10 and 11. So the partners like Britannica, Discovery, National Geographic, Wolfram, Fermat, local partners in Egypt like Nahdat Masr and many others, they actually mapped each and every lesson of the curriculum and made it available on the EKB. So this had already happened starting 2018, luckily, fortunately in this situation. So such that this was already available online for the grade 10 and 11 students. And the electronic testing also had already taken place before. And so this just was a continuation of that. There wasn't much transition happening there for those two grade levels. For the next group, which are the grade 3s to grade 9, this was interesting because they had not yet been affected by the educational transformation that Egypt was going through. But now, as a result of this situation, first of all, there was a quick study portal that was created for this group, which was an offshoot of the EKB, where again, their lessons were mapped to be offered online. And they were required to, instead of sitting for an end of year exam, they were required to submit a project at the end of the academic year that demonstrated their language skills, social studies, sciences, math. It was an sort of interdisciplinary sort of project that they did instead of sitting for an exam. And this, I want to stop here in particular because this was important. It's not just a logistical solution, to submit a project instead of sitting for an exam. It's actually a change, major change for Egyptian families and the mindset that you are able to assess students in a way that is not an exam. There are other tools of assessments and there are other ways to assess learning and to see and find out how much a child has learned. That does not have to be an exam, and that's very new to the culture here. We are all it's very test oriented historically, and we're all really tied to the exam grades. And so this was a really almost revolutionary concept to ask the students to do something very different to assess their learning. And finally, the last group, the KGs to grade 2s, these are actually the main group receiving a totally new system of education. That in 2018, it went up to grade 1, and then in 2019-20, it was up to grade 2. And so they are following a very different curriculum that we refer to in Egypt as Education 2.0. This is where the actual change started with the change in the education system. And it's learning through play, project-based learning. And so here, they had to lean on the parents a little and ask them to go together with the teachers through the curriculum online and help the kids do some of these projects and do some of these games. Meanwhile, the ministry also partnered with Edmodo for both the teachers and the students to communicate and to submit their online work. So it was really, I would say the response was really quick given the scale and given the numbers. There was a lot of innovation. Obviously, this was highly dependent on, distance learning and online availability. And so there was also a lot of synergy from other parts of the government. The Ministry of Communication provided through the mobile operators here SIM cards that were free of charge for students who have smartphones or who have means to be online. And obviously there were also lessons offered through TV channels and for those who could not be online. But for the most part, despite many challenges, I think the response was quick, and some of it there was some luck due to the fact that some of this had started a couple of years earlier.
Thank you, Nelly. I actually do want to follow up on two of the 2 points that you mentioned in terms of the COVID-19 has shifted the way education is being implemented in your country and many of the other countries. And in a way, it's being looked at as facilitating 21st century skills. Students, as we've been seeing, are increasingly resorting to multiple sources to understand concepts better, to learn new concepts, relying on teachers as coaches rather than instructors, like we've seen previously. So the critical thinking approach to learning is interesting and may lead in our region to lifelong learners, which is a critical skill that is needed in this century. That is, that's very interesting, and we'll see how that unfolds. Time will tell. I also wanted to follow up on another point that you mentioned in terms of collaboration. So for example, here in Jordan, we've seen a public-private kind of collaboration. We have a platform, education portal called Darsak, which came about through a partnership between a couple of ministries and a private enterprise. While the content of the lessons taught were taken directly from the Jordanian national curriculum, yet it was crowdsourced from different local educational organizations. So it resulted in a one-stop shop that delivers weekly scheduled classes for all grades. So, despite, I'm trying to look at the bright side of the challenges that we've been facing, and it's definitely, teaching us that things are possible, and strengthening kind of partnerships, whether among different governments or between public, private, government institutions. So Fernando, that's the next question is for you from the lens of education. So I wanted to learn more from you about the opportunities that COVID-19 surfaced that we could learn from moving on.
I think you said it well, Nawal. This opportunity has helped us suspend belief on many of our deeply held assumptions about how education should be instructed, and help us discover the great potential that our students have if we give them more autonomy. All the wonderful things that are possible if we engage parents more directly with education. I do agree with you that there is a silver lining, that there is a bright side. At the same time, I don't want to underplay that this is a global calamity, not only because of the number of people who have died, but how this has disrupted society in so many ways, shutting down jobs, for example, for many people.
Absolutely.
And this is not over. It's not nearly over. We don't know when the end will be in sight. And of course, in education, not every kid has the same capacity to learn independently, the same support at home. So I do think, and I am finding in my research, that there's a very real possibility that this crisis is going to augment all pre-existing forms of inequality. But I do hope that we will be able to recognize the goodness that is happening even in the middle of this pandemic. And to me, it is a result of, first of all, getting parents to recognize how important that expanded set of skills actually is as they watch their children learn. And I'm hoping that this will be the foundation of a wider movement where society expects more of schools and gets more directly involved in demanding schools for actually delivering a breadth of skills. I'm also hoping that this pandemic is going to cause many educators and education administrators to recognize that we can do this work much better if we work hand in hand with parents and with communities than we have in the past. I'm hoping that this is going to cause governments to realize that governments don't have the monopoly of the capacity to come up with good ideas, that there are many good ideas that exist in civil society organizations, in smaller actors, in businesses. I'll give you an example. One of the case studies that we conducted, it's an amazing case study where two young people, 25 years old, were able to do something a government had been able to do. And it's a case study of two people who are part of the Teach for Chile network, an organization like Teach for America that is integrated in a network of 55 similar organizations. And when the government of Chile decided we're going to shut down schools, these young people said, but wait a moment, our students are our responsibility, not the government. What are we going to do? And because they are interconnected in a network with peers in 55 different countries, they receive a newsletter. And they heard that their colleagues in Nigeria had actually used their iPhones to record their lessons and broadcast them through WhatsApp. So these two young people began to produce lessons that were so engaging, so entertaining, that within a week, everyone in that city was listening to the lessons, not just their students. And the mayor noticed, and he shared that information with mayors in 240 cities. Within 2 weeks, there was a network of 240 radio stations throughout the country that was broadcasting those lessons. And the organization then said, let's actually not just depend on the good work of these two people, let's put 50 people like them. So here you have an example of how First of all, good ideas can come from anywhere, including from 225-year-olds who are able to do something more swiftly, more innovatively, faster than a government, and that it is a smart sign of a government to open itself to recognizing those innovations and augmenting its reach and its potential. So I think these are some of the silver linings. The reason it's important to look for those lessons is the following. I've just finished writing a book on education on climate change, on what it is that schools could do to slow down climate change. And as part of the many things that I read on the subject, I found this fascinating research that shows that it's not enough to be aware and to worry about climate change, that if you actually worry too much and have no hope that you can make a difference, this actually causes you to disengage from the problem. You drown in the complexity. But when you combine awareness and worry with hope, then you actually are much more likely to do something about it. So building hope in this crisis is critical. And hope, based on that research on climate change, is about seeing a pathway that connects you to finding a solution to the crisis. So I believe in this pandemic, it is our shared responsibility. It is the responsibility of anyone in a leadership position. And this means each and every one of you who's here this morning. It is our responsibility to help people have hope and not drown in the complexity. And that means help them find a pathway where a small step, you don't need to be a minister of education to be part of a solution. You don't need to be the CEO of a large education company like Sajida. Each and every one of us can find something that we can do that can make a difference and that can build hope. And I'm hoping that the Harvard clubs and the Harvard Alumni Association will rise up to the occasion, will rise to its responsibility, so that at the end of this pandemic, there is a renaissance. There is an additional reason to do that. Just like the Medicis were a wonderful, and their work in Florence were a wonderful byproduct of that pandemic, pandemic can have horrible effects. The pandemic of 1918 contributed to the rise of Hitler in Germany. And the way in which it contributed is because the reduction in the ability of the state to deliver services caused many people to radicalize and to basically engage with hateful ideologies. The New York Times today has a 4-page article on the rise of Nazism within the German military. So the reality is that this pandemic could cause a world that would unravel into something terrible. And I think whether we go one way or another is not up to what others do, is up to what each and every one of us does to rise up to the moment and to exercise our responsibility of building hope.
Absolutely, indeed. Fernando, I have a question here. Someone is asking, what is the website of the 2 students who did the game-changing way to spread classes via WhatsApp?
I actually wrote a case study about them. I have shared, I'll do it again. I've shared a website with all these various case studies, but while we talk, I'll find it and I'll post it on the link.
Perfect,
okay?
Perfect. Thank you very much. So Sajida, I wanted to ask you about your perspective. What are some of the advantages and disadvantages of online education? And did it really work in the UAE?
Thanks. Thank you, Noel. So I just wanted to echo a little bit of what Fernando said. So global events such as world wars and past pandemics have led to quantum shifts in society, right? For example, during World War II, we all know this, because all the American men were at war, women were allowed to participate in the workforce, and many believe this was a temporary aberration. Now, history has shown just how wrong they were, thankfully, right? How does this translate to us today? As a result of our global event, this pandemic, the education sector has been forced to undergo a paradigm shift of its own. Online or virtual learning went from a good to have periphery to a must have, forcing every stakeholder to embrace this new way of learning. So what could this mean for a post-COVID era for education? Some parents saw that they didn't have to be stressed about getting their kids to school every morning, fighting traffic and juggling, myriad balls to fit into rigid school schedules. Many more parents have a deep longing for schools to just reopen so that they can have some freedom from their kids. Regardless, there is a growing percentage that is embracing the flexibility of virtual learning and its advantages. So what could a post-COVID education or school look like? One of the projects that we, Altamont Group, is working on with the government is a notion of a disrupted, decentralized education offering, okay? One that embraces all the advantages of a virtual learning academic platform, but also provides a roadmap for 360-degree development of the child, including Fernando's 21st century skills. Our pilot could have a group of the top teachers in the world. Naturally, they would be Harvard-trained teachers, teaching a US or UK curriculum to students in their homes in the UAE at a lower cost of about $5,000 a year in an environment where the average fees are close to $30,000 a year. So the post-COVID era is going to bring about significant new ways of living, learning, and teaching. In terms of advantages and disadvantages to online education, I think first we need to define what is online education, as everyone understands it a little differently. Most schools across the GCC transitioned fairly quickly to what we want to call remote learning, which means that the teachers just taught the same curriculum using the same pedagogy, just remotely. Moreover, while some schools tried to have live teaching, which enabled interaction, many others just did asynchronous teaching with limited teacher-student interaction. Overall, one might say that those schools who were technology enabled were able to shift faster and provide a more integrated, interactive online learning program. Others provided the remote learning program that I've just described. So now what are some pros and cons? And we've actually discussed a lot of this already, but let me just summarize and reiterate a little bit. The pros of a remote learning, online learning environment is that it allows for maintaining educational continuity, okay? So even for those children whose parents are, for example, transferred frequently, or children who have health issues or concerns, they can continue to be educated. In this case, within a pandemic, the education didn't stop, it was still continuous, okay? Online learning is also more aligned with the future of university education and a rapidly increasing number of workplaces across the globe. Even more so, we've seen this during the pandemic, right? Where a lot of us are working from home. And then the other advantage is that students are in control of their schedule. So there's flexibility for them to mix and match their subjects, but also mix and match sort of other things they want to do in their personal time, including extracurricular activities, socialization, etc. There's also the opportunity for individualized learning and support. And lastly, online education enables safe learning spaces for students with health issues or financial constraints or other limitations. And it does enable agility and innovation, something that we've seen, through the multiple examples that we've all discussed. Of course, there are some cons. There is an intense requirement for self-discipline and self-direction. And socialization can sometimes get missed out. But as you pointed out, actually, as also Nawal, is that you're building other skills, the ability to be independent, to be a proactive self-learner. These are critical lifelong learning skills that are actually very much developed by using remote learning or online learning. So in terms of, what worked or what didn't work, ultimately we would say that, learning remained continuous, which is a huge positive and plus. What we learned is that it's important to not only have teachers that are engaged and have the necessary training and skills, but also that parents need to take some responsibility in the whole online learning scenario for it to be truly successful. As we go forward, all of us will need to adopt future-focused skills that allow us to take advantage of the one constant that's going to be happening always. That is change. Change will be the one constant. The key skill that everyone will have to embrace is using technology in every part of our lives. What the end picture looks like is just a hypothesis right now. However, embracing innovation and staying agile will increase opportunities for success. And I would say, I'll echo again what Fernando said, remember that with hope and collaboration, we can have a renaissance across the world, particularly in education. Thanks, Noah.
Thanks, Sajida. What a great segue. To my question to Nelly about how can governments further support schools and teachers to ensure minimal disruption of the learning process?
Thank you, Noel. I think for all of us, and even historically during times of crisis, usually the most comforting sign, and I know we talked a lot about this in class with Fernando when we were back in school, one of the most comforting signs is when schools are back in session, right? This is when you know that, okay, now everything's back to normal and it's safe enough for the children to be outside of the house, whether it's a war or a natural disaster or now this situation we're in. But the challenge now here for us is that, you know, no one is totally sure how this will unfold in the coming weeks and months prior to the, you know, start of the new academic year, new school year in most countries of the world. So I think, and this is sort of re-echoing what Sajida and Fernando were saying, there is a need now to sort of change the mindset. What does it mean to be in school and to be learning? That does not necessarily mean to physically go somewhere anymore, right? Or it could be a combination of things. It could be going sometime and then not going and staying at home and learning remotely. So I think this change of mindset will require you know, a lot of effort from all of us, everybody who is involved, whether you're a parent or whether you're an educator, whether you're a member of the government. It will also require collaboration from all sectors of the government to contribute to this new mindset. And even across governments, like we mentioned earlier, you know, any form of collaboration that could help anyone else, like for instance, opening up online libraries for access and like the example we mentioned earlier with the EKB, that is another example of how to contribute to changing this mindset, to helping people know that there are different ways to learn. There are different ways for students to benefit from the available materials and platforms, etc. Definitely, you know, private-public partnerships are now almost a necessity. We really have to, you know, all put our heads together, whether we're in the private sector or the public sector, to see how we can all move towards this new mindset, this new idea of what does it mean to learn and what does it mean to teach at a time like this. So I would say the first step to ensure that there is minimal disruption is to support and help disseminate this idea that there are many ways to learn, and and that the real goal of going to school is to understand and to learn, and not to only show up, right? So there's and this I think we all learned in so many different ways. Even now with work, you know, we discovered, okay, I don't have to physically be at the desk from 9 to 5. I can still deliver and I can still do what I need to get done, even if I'm not physically there. So we're all learning that slowly, and we're not all accepting it in the same way and at the same level, you know, of acceptance. But I think there's work for us to do in this space. There's some effort that needs to be made in that direction of thinking, what really is it that I benefit from going to school as a parent sending their child to school? And will I be able to still do that even if they're not physically somewhere? Could there still be a community of learners even if we're not meeting every day? That's also key, because that's one important thing we do at school. It's not just the academic subjects, obviously. It's all the skills that we learn socially and otherwise from being with other people. So I think if we all work in that direction, there will be a better chance for less disruption in the learning process.
Absolutely, thank you, Nelly. Fernando, I have a question here. So the question is, what kind of protocols, plans, guidelines should countries, authorities, entities, etc. consider for the restart of schools for the academic year 2020-2021? So also taking into consideration, not all children have access to technology, internet, like mentioned in the introduction. What kind of resources should children be, you know, supported with? And, you know, if you could tell us more about what plans they could take into consideration for reopening schools.
Yes, so one of our reports actually makes 25 specific recommendations to develop a strategy for continuity. I do think it's very important for those strategies to be specific not only to countries, but to particular locations, and to be developed in close coordination with public health authorities. For example, take the United States at the moment. A strategy that would make sense would look very different in a place like the state of Massachusetts than in the state of Texas, because both are at very different states of the epidemic. And for that reason, I think, certainly this strategy should not put children at risk and should not contribute to spread. I also think that the kinds of things that are feasible in a country that has a declining population and relatively ample infrastructure relative to kids like Germany is very different than what is possible in a place where you have overcrowded classrooms and not enough infrastructure for the kids. Having said that, I do think it is possible to have a strategy that sustains education in any context, that uses a multiplicity of channels to reach the children. It is not the case at all that the only options are between physical instruction and online instruction. Some of the cases that I have conducted have developed a very rich network that includes radio education, face-to-face materials, television education, along with online education. And some of the case studies in the websites that I have presented document those. Look in particular at the strategy developed in the city of Bogota and in the state of Sao Paulo. It is also absolutely possible to reach the poorest kids. One of the things I have discovered is how widespread WhatsApp is and how many people actually have access to mobiles. They may not have access to smartphones, but they have access to mobiles, and there is a lot that can be done with these devices. So I think what is important here is to begin with the student and the context in mind, and to use a design thinking framework in asking, number one, what are the goals? Number two, what are the needs of that population? Number three, how do we best serve them? So for example, the city of Bogota began and very quickly developed a prototype that was, let's create an online platform. They did that within a week. And they quickly discovered that that only reached 30% of the kids. And then they said, okay, let's now develop something on TV and radio. And that reached 80% of the kids, but there were still 20% of the kids that were not being reached. So they said, let's go and knock on their doors and let's bring them materials. But within a month, they had realized that only was taking care of the educational need. Many children receive other services in schools, food, health support, mental health support. So there is one large state that I'm advising, I can't name the state right now, in a country in Latin America that is considering a strategy that would involve bringing the kids physically to school once a week, face-to-face, and then continuing the rest of the instruction through this variety of means, now with a platform where it's possible to track how engaged the kid is and how much of the content they're following, so that you basically use the full set of facilities of the school for 1/5 of the student population at a given time. So I think that there are many different ways. It would make no sense for me to say, well, Jordan should do what this state does, because your circumstances are different. Your situation in terms of the epidemic is different. Your situation in terms of infrastructure is different. But what I think what is essential is to have a strategy in place. And I think it is important to plan that strategy, not to plan that strategy with sufficient time. In March, if I think about Harvard, for example, we had to put in place a strategy in a week, which is hardly the best way to do that. We then made the decision we now are going to offer at least the entire fall semester, and for some schools, the entire year online. That gives us the summer to plan the best online instruction that we can deliver. And that's going to mean a very different educational experience for the students than something that has been cooked in a hurry. So I think that is what every government should be doing. I think it's very important to embrace this with great flexibility and generosity on the parts of all people. So for example, the state that I'm working with is going to require essentially combined 2 school years, and is going to require working more hours for teachers so that we serve all the students, work on weekends, get rid of some of the holiday downtime. And I mean, that's the reason the government has to look at this carefully. If all the stakeholders embrace this moment as the real moment of crisis and emergency that it is, and with a spirit of generosity, I'm sure that we can find effective solutions. If on the other hand, people hunker down in their positions and they say, well, that's not in my job description, that's not in my contract, I'm not going to do it, then it's going to be a little bit harder to find a solution.
Thank you, Fernando. We're running over by a few minutes, but we have 2 final questions that we can wrap up with. Maybe Nelly, so could you share with us some of the pros and cons of transitioning to long-term blended learning? Any examples you could share with us? So by the way, for people who aren't in education, blended learning brings together learning in classroom, in person, with online learning, both together, blended learning. Yep, over to you, Nelly.
Thanks, Noel. So yeah, I mean, obviously there are some clear pros of blended learning is, you know, the flexibility that it could be more efficient use of your time instead of the commuting every day. There's so many things we can look at that are positive. You can go back and see what you missed when, like, this session is recorded. Anyone who did not attend can replay it. So these are all advantages of the online portion of blended learning. And obviously you get the opportunity when you do the face-to-face part to see your peers, to see your teachers, to be in contact face-to-face. This is when the teacher gets an opportunity to explain things better or to differentiate their teaching, because that's another challenge online, that their differentiation is a challenge for teachers online to cater to the different abilities of their students. Another challenge, you know, is the consistency. Not all the teachers are the same in terms of their comfort level with dealing with the technology online. So you could get like a really very different experience in math from two different teachers, for instance, if you're online, just because the teacher is more comfortable using the tools available. And, or for any other subjects, obviously. Like Fernando mentioned earlier, you know, some students could fall behind if they're not unable to follow what's going on online. They don't have the means, the technology to help them follow. They don't have a good internet connection. There's so many challenges of that sort as well. But I think what really matters, whether, you know, it's blended or learning or online learning or face-to-face learning, is to always remember that the reason what is the end goal, you know? Is it to sit for an exam and get a grade, or is it to really understand or acquire new skills? And I think if everyone is focused on that, teachers, parents, and students, that the teaching is happening for understanding. It's not happening because we're teaching to a test. Then you have a better chance of succeeding, whether it's blended or online or face-to-face. I think that's really key. And like I mentioned earlier, this idea of creating a community of learners is very important. Again, and the blended learning gives you the opportunity, you know, to meet every once in a while, or every week, or in whatever way it's structured. And I think this supports this idea of creating a community of learners who can exchange ideas and who can benefit from being together in the same group. In terms of examples, I really, I mean, I think there are lots of examples around the world, and in light of COVID, I know that some of the countries that went back to where their children went back to school have already been experimenting with blended learning. I know there in some parts of Germany, some schools follow the blended learning approach. I know Scotland has just announced that they're gonna go back to school in August using a blended learning approach. So there's so many different you know, examples around the world. I know in some parts of South Korea, the teachers went back to school. They were teaching from school, but online to their students, but they were physically in their old classrooms again. So there's just, I think, a lot of mixing and matching that could happen here. Lots of endless opportunities, I believe, to make this a success in the end.
Thank you very much, Nelly. I'm just going to ask the last question to Sajida, and unfortunately we'll have to wrap up afterwards. So Sajida, post-COVID-19, do you anticipate the education policies to change, remain the same, or go back to what they were?
So I think as students and parents become more educated consumers of education providers are realizing that they have to provide greater transparency, and regulators are enabling greater accountability. What this means is that overall there's an increased understanding of the importance of transparent quality assurance, as well as national accreditation, which also ties into ensuring that teachers are properly qualified, certified, and continuously upskilled. And this is particularly relevant in our region when we have so many expat teachers who kind of come and go. Of course, there's an increasing use of technology. So luckily, there's also an understanding that technology is a wonderful tool to enable and support learning, but it's not teaching itself. Technology is a tool, okay? And given the global state of affairs, incorporating sustainability and resilience studies is also seen as very future forward. So I think in some ways we're going back to basics with a focus on ensuring that foundational skills are firmly in place, and there's now greater openness to distance online learning as a credible alternative option, with the inkling that a policy should be put in place for this. So in terms of policies changing, they're definitely going to change. We have to be much more proactive and open and agile. And the governments, we're seeing this across the board in terms of how many of them have reacted to the situation. What I think is being put in place is measures that can support the quality of education, but also support the school providers as well as enable the teachers. But it also does entail that the parents need to be a little bit more involved and engaged in their children's education. It can't just be left to school. So I think these are benefits and these are truly silver linings of what's happened. I think that there's now a wonderful focus on encouraging child-led learning with the teacher as a facilitator of continuous lifelong learning, which is supported by the use of virtual learning opportunities. So I think in all of this, we're seeing that the government is also seeing the value of the different components coming together and truly working hand in hand. So a collaboration at that micro level will get expanded hopefully to the macro level. And I do believe, and we're going to see hopefully very soon, inshallah, some changes in policy that are aligned with this much more holistic approach.
Well, hopefully, inshallah, as you said. I wanted to take the opportunity to once again thank our panelists, Fernando, Nelly, and Sajida. It's been really a pleasure working with you. I also wanted to thank the Harvard clubs of UAE and Egypt for collaborating with us, the Club of Jordan. And I also wanted to thank our attendees for today and for their interactive and proactive participation. I received a lot of private messages with questions. Too bad that we've allocated only 75 minutes for this session. Thank you very much for joining us today, and we do hope to organize another session focusing on another sector in collaboration with different clubs very soon. Thanks again, and have a good evening or a good day, depending on where you are. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for bringing us together.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye. Nawal?